So glad that you could all be here for um, uh, our webinar this afternoon on disability and communicating effectively, which is a very timely topic. We are going to be recording the webinar, of course. If you have questions at all during the slideshow presentation, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat or to reach out on the video feed, and we'll answer your questions through the presentation. My name is Elizabeth Novak, and I am the program coordinator with the Discoverability Network. And I would like to introduce my co-host for this afternoon's presentation, Liz. Liz, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. My name is Elizabeth Muller. Today you can call me Liz. I work as a project coordinator at Ryerson Magnet on the Inclusive Hiring Project, on a project called Align, and I'm really excited to be here today talking about language and communication with everyone.
Excellent. And we do have our two ASL interpreters. You can pin them if you like, but they should be visible on the screen for you if you're deaf or hard of hearing. So let's get started with communicating inclusively. And before we get into the meat of our presentation, we just need to do a land acknowledgement. And we'd like to say that the Ontario Chamber of Commerce acknowledges that the work we do takes place on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And Toronto, or Takaronto as it was known back in the day, is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Our regional hubs and partners across Canada similarly gather on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. Can I have the next slide, please? So what are we going to talk about today? Why the words we use matter, because what we say does matter and it conveys our thoughts and our feelings. But language changes and evolves even today. And when in doubt, what you should do when you're talking about language as it relates to disability, and we're going to learn a little disability etiquette as well. So before we get started as well, we're going to talk about what is the Discoverability Network, and we're the program that we run these Honest Conversations weekly webinars. And we're a program that that's been created through the Ontario Chamber of Commerce about 5 years ago. And we surveyed our business partners and found that the greatest barrier to employment is hiring untapped pools of talent. So we have labor shortages. So the Discoverability Network was created as a job matching platform that connects businesses to job seekers with disabilities to meet business and workforce needs. So we provide, oh, can you go back to the slide? Thank you, Megan. So we do that through an online job matching platform. We also provide free training on a variety of disability and inclusion topics like disclosure and accommodations in the workplace, job search and telling your story, professionalism in social media. And we provide this training to job seekers, employers, and employment service providers. And we also provide free networking events so you can connect. So job seekers with disabilities can connect to inclusive employers, and the job seekers can learn about the company, the hiring practices, and what they need to do to submit their application. And we also do weekly networking sessions, such as today's Honest Conversation. We run our Honest Conversations webinars every Thursday from 1 until 2 p.m. And perhaps I can have Jeff or Megan put into the chat the website address for accessing the Discoverability Network. All three features of the program that I have talked about are of course free. Okay, And there's our website address. I should also mention that you will be getting a copy of today's slide deck emailed to you by tomorrow, so you don't have to worry about taking notes during our presentation, which is just wonderful. All right, can we have the next slide, please? All right, so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Liz to talk about language matters.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So, like Elizabeth touched on, the language that we use does provide insight into what we believe, and it does matter. Language changes over time, right? You probably can think about examples in your own life of language that might have been appropriate at one time, but is no longer appropriate now. And we want to use words that are current and positive and reflect our values, and a workplace where everybody feels welcome and included. So if we think about the word invalid, it can mean, or invalid, it can mean not acceptable, not appropriate. Handicapped, it can bring to mind somebody on the corner who's begging, right? And that's that kind of traditional like March of Dimes way back in the day where somebody was standing there with a cap begging for money. So those are words that we did use at one time, but now they have sort of negative connotations, so we don't use those words anymore. So next slide. Thank you. So disability terminology. So maybe in the chat, people could put, just some examples of maybe terms that you're familiar with or you've heard, and terms that perhaps you're not so sure about. And this is a really tricky one because sometimes terms we aren't sure about can be offensive, but sometimes they can also be terms that have been reclaimed. So the word CRIP is now very common in disability studies, CRIP literature, CRIP art, CRIP music, but that term also could at one time have been seen as offensive because it meant cripple. So people have kind of taken that term back and they've reclaimed it to mean something else. So Elizabeth, do you see any terms that people have put in the chat that resemble things that they may be unsure about or things they've heard?
Nothing in the chat. I will mention a word.
Oh,
retarded.
Yes.
Yes, somebody mentioned that. That's very old school. We don't use that term today unless we're talking about using the term, but it's considered offensive for those with developmental disabilities today.
Yes, and we've got another really great question in here. Physically challenged, mentally challenged, question mark. Typically we wouldn't say that. We would say has a physical disability, lives with a developmental disability, because challenge implies lack, loss, negativity, and that's not how a lot of us with disabilities see ourselves. So those were great examples. Thank you so much for popping those in. I think we'll move to the next slide. Great. So if we think about terminology, it can be challenging, right? There are multiple definitions of disability. So there's, the medical definition of disability, the legal definition of disability. And there are words or word associations that can often be negative associated with those definitions. And there are many, many types of disabilities. There are physical, there are developmental, there are intellectual, there are cognitive, there are learning disabilities. So there are many different types of disabilities, and how we talk about that actually matters. And categorizing can be challenging, partly because sometimes people have more than one disability. It can also be challenging because sometimes people may not identify as having a specific label or disability, but it can also be challenging because sometimes labels can come with negative connotations. So sometimes people don't want to be labeled. So categorizing can be really challenging for a lot of different reasons. And we need to consider our words with care and think about why we're labeling or why we're categorizing. We never group people. We never say the disabled or the cognitively challenged. So we don't group people in those categories. We tend to want to say people with, and we'll get into that later. But categorizing can be challenging for a whole bunch of reasons. It can also sort of segregate people when we really want to think about having an inclusive mindset. Elizabeth, models of disability.
Okay, models of disability, and they may influence your word choice. So some of you may be aware, we actually talk about at the Discoverability Network, we talk about the social model of disability as a socially constructed idea. So we talk about the disabled world, we talk about how disability is a mismatch between the environment or the workplace and the person with the disability. We don't go with the medical model of disability, which is what it has traditionally been for a very long time, where you see disability as a disease. There are limitations placed on disability, restrictions. Disability is seen as something to be cured. Um, you can look at disability in terms of the identity model. So disability as an identity. And then there are some communities where really you're actually, you can be defined by your disability. There's the human rights model where you see disability as a human rights issue, something to work towards integrating into society. There's the cultural model, seeing disability as a culture. And maybe, Liz, you can speak to this, where there are some communities where they do see disability as a culture.
Yeah, absolutely, Elizabeth. Disability can be seen as a culture in terms of things that are unique to that disability or that group. So there's a lot of scholars that talk about access, intimacy, and so perhaps deaf culture. So there's a whole, we know about sign language, for example, as a part of deaf culture. There might be culture within the vision loss community, things that are unique to that community, perhaps things like audio description or the use of braille and other tactile means. So there can be cultural nuances to disability, even the way art by disabled artists, curated by disabled artists for the disability and broader community is displayed, can be a cultural form of disability. So it's really taking disability and putting it into an affirmative, positive light, and really talking about some of the really beautiful underpinnings that a disability culture can have.
There is the charity model of disability, which isn't quite as positive, and that's where you see disability as a victimhood, and that's where you can sometimes see it with employment, where employers feel that hiring persons with disabilities, it's part of the charity model. It just kind of would make them feel better, feel good. But really, that's not a model that we want to go with. There's also the economic model of disability, where disability is seen as a challenge to productivity. I personally think disability enhances productivity. That's my personal experience and professional experience as a person with a disability working within employment. How do you see it, Liz?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There's a lot of literature that talks about sort of this bioeconomic loss that's caused by disability, but in fact, that's a really sort of deficit model of looking at disability. So certainly, we're wanting to look at it from a more social model, affirmative model, or cultural model would be sort of the models that I think are more prevalent and positive.
I think also Matthew has mentioned in the chat there was the term special needs. He mentioned that the term is outdated. And it's okay when we're here and we're saying words that may not be so politically correct today. We're talking about them in the context of them going out of date. So it's okay to say these words kind of in the context of this presentation. So the term special needs, yes, it is an outdated terminology. I don't know if you can speak to that, Liz, what you know from your own research and studies.
Yeah, for sure. So I think special needs sort of implies that it's a unique need that that individual has that everyone else doesn't. But if we sort of think about inclusive design for learning, so principles of equity and flexibility and principles of adaptability, that then incorporates a broad spectrum of needs. And so if we're teaching inclusively, then there's less need for accommodation and therefore kind of that emphasis on special needs. Not to say that there wouldn't be any need for an accommodation, but certainly if you're using a more universal design for learning approach, that kind of promotes a more inclusive environment where you're not necessarily focusing on the special needs of one student. It sort of centers people out.
All right, can we have the next slide, please? All right, language changes and evolves. And I love this. This is what we were talking about in the term developmental disability. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, medical terminology for developmental disability was feeble minded. So people with increasingly severe disabilities were classified as morons, imbeciles, and idiots, which, I mean, today you couldn't even imagine calling somebody that just because they have a developmental disability. By the mid 1900s, the term mentally retarded or mentally handicapped was used. We totally know that's not acceptable today. By the 1970s, the terms developmentally handicapped, developmentally disabled, and intellectual disability were used. And today we use the terms intellectual disability and developmental disability. And I think that's going to change again. I know from my personal experience, I have albinism, and it's still very common today to get people go, oh, well, you're albino. And for members of the albinism community, we prefer the term we're a person with albinism, or we have albinism, not the term albino. And sometimes, I get people going, oh, I'm so sorry I said that. I didn't mean to. It's just that you don't know, okay? And that's what we're going to be talking about as well. It's okay to make mistakes as long as you learn from them and you move forward with using the preferred terminology that the person with the disability lets you know they'd like you to use. All right, can we have the next slide, please? All right, so how language has changed. So we look at the term the disabled, there's referring to a group like that. We don't want to say the disabled, we want to say persons with disabilities. You might say someone is confined to a wheelchair. The correct terminology is a person who uses a wheelchair. Then we have mental handicap. You might want to say that you're a person with you would want to say you're a person with an intellectual disability. What about whether you're normal? Well, you're non-disabled. All right, that is the correct term. Perhaps you are crazy or mad. That's what the term we use sometimes in jest. You're a person with a mental health disability or condition. And can we just ask that if you're not talking, you just mute yourself. There's a bit of background noise there. Thank you. So you could be someone who suffers from, the correct term is a person with, poor or challenged, a person with a disability. Okay. Disabled parking. I love the term accessible parking. Or handicapped washroom. I'm not hearing that so much anymore. It's accessible washroom. Okay. And we have in the chat, what is the sentiment towards the term differently abled as opposed to disabled? I personally, and this is just me, I don't have a problem with using the term disabled. Differently abled, I'm not, I mean, I'm fine with using the two terms interchangeably. Liz, what do you think?
That's coming up on the next slide, so maybe we could just park that one for because we actually talk about it in the next slide.
Okay, and learning difficulties was another way of phrasing it as well. We had that as well. And we're going to be talking about this coming up in the next few slides, Matthew. What about, can we use people first language or disability first language or both? We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And we had the question about what about the terms neurotypical and neurodiverse individuals? That's absolutely correct terminology to use if you're describing someone who has autism or is on the autism spectrum. You say they're neurotypical, they're neurodiverse. Neurodiversity is the correct term to use. Do you have anything else to add to that, Liz?
No, I don't.
Okay, next slide, please. All right. So using current terminology, it's okay to use the word disability. Well, there you go.
So I think this one is mine.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, this is a really important one. The problem with words like differently abled or diverse abilities is they're sort of euphemisms. So they erase disability, which is not only a part of our identity, but it kind of is this underlying message that disability is a negative thing. So it's something that we need to erase. So it sends sort of this tacit message that if we just don't say it, it won't exist, and it doesn't really then account for all of the barriers, environmental and social, that people with disabilities experience, because it's an erasure of the term. We've already kind of talked about avoiding outdated terminology like handicapped or special needs. That is debatable. I do know that there are some educators who still call themselves special needs assistants or special needs educators. So that one I think is becoming outdated, but that might be a personal preference. You might say to somebody, how do you want to be identified? I know there are some people that feel very strongly that they have special needs and those needs need to be addressed, and so that might be one where you ask. Avoiding euphemisms which are unclear. The other problem about diverse ability or differently abled is it's not really clear. Like different, how, what. So disability really calls out what it is. Handy capable or capable is another one that I've seen. I think they're trying to be positive, but it's really sort of an erasure of an identity. And I know, Elizabeth, you asked me my opinion a minute ago. I do find them offensive myself, but again, terminology can also be very personal. So, if somebody wants to be called that, then that's what you would call them. And then diverse abilities, which we talked about. So we'll go to the next slide. So we want to avoid labeling if we can. So instead of, or in addition to the word disability, some people prefer name of the disability or the diagnosis. So I live with autism, or I live with a visual disability. I have a mental health concern or an illness, or I've experienced mental health trauma. We don't generally say suffers from mental illness, but you can say I've experienced a mental health concern, or I have a mental health concern. To state a connection or to a disability community, you can say that you're a self-advocate of X disability or for X disability. So, for example, patient, client, but you can say, I'm a self-advocate within the vision loss community. I'm a self-advocate within the spina bifida community. I live with spina bifida. So there's lots of different ways that you can talk about disability. And, person first language versus identity first language is a whole other workshop. Most of the time, I tend to use person first language because disability is a part of my identity, but it's not my whole identity. I bring lots of identities to my work. So I don't tend to forefront or foreload disability. And again, I don't see the disability as kind of the only thing that defines me. So I say person with. I'm a person first that brings lots of identities to my work.
And I think that's important as well, because certainly when you're talking around mental health these days, Liz, it's still very common for people to say, oh, that person suffers from
Yes.
mental illness. I prefer the term lives with, a mental health disability or lives with mental illness. That's kind of what I deem to be politically correct.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's a great point, Elizabeth. And if we go to slide 14, we can actually see there's a nice a table here. So, like I've said, emphasizes the person. It's part of a person. And then we can see here identity first language. So you can see disabled person, disability, or blind deaf. So the thing here that, again, you want to be really careful of is not grouping. So you could say a disabled person, but you wouldn't say the disabled, because again, it's that grouping of people. So it conveys that people are disabled by their environment, that disability is a collective experience, and that's, again, that social model piece that Elizabeth talked about. So I'll turn it back to you, Elizabeth.
All right. So I think we're going to move into it's kind of a hard thing to say, isn't it, though, Liz, because when we look at certain Countries, it really depends on whether they use person first identity language, person first language for disability, or identity first language for disability. And certainly in Canada, we're towards the point of person first language when it comes to talking about disability. Disability does not totally define who you are, but it is a part of who you are. And that's certainly what I believe. I go with the person first language use of disability.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you're right. It's again, it's a very personal and political thing of what type of language to use. So absolutely.
All right. Before we go any further, does anybody have any questions about person first or identity first language? Because it is a complex concept to understand that. We want to know that identity first language conveys that people are disabled by their environment. Disability is a collective experience arising from systemic barriers and not an individual trait, or perhaps seen as a person's health condition. We really want to, at least in Canada, go with person first language, where it's the person with the disability, emphasize the person first and the disability second, or you have people with disabilities, and disability is a part of who you are. So can we go on to the next slide, please? All right, so here we're getting into language do's and don'ts. And I know we've kind of been talking a lot about what is acceptable terminology and what is non-acceptable terminology. And this can seem daunting because the last thing that people want to do is they want to offend someone with a disability by saying the wrong thing. And sometimes you are going to say the wrong thing or make a mistake because it's a lot of terms to keep track of. And it's okay to make mistakes, certainly. When you are using disability language, you want to avoid superlatives such as brave, courageous, and special. We certainly see this in the media with what we call disability porn, where people with disabilities are kind of portrayed as being superhuman and special because they have a disability. We're basically just like anybody else. We want to be treated like everyone else in society. Our disability is just a part of us. It doesn't make us special.
That's a great point, Elizabeth. And if anybody's interested, Stella Young does a fantastic TED talk on what she calls inspiration porn, and it's actually called "I'm Not Your Inspiration," and it's a fantastic talk about everything Elizabeth's just said on this slide.
Could you put that? Can you put her name in the chat, Liz? Because
sure,
that
absolutely.
would be a really great resource. I love TED Talks, absolutely. You don't want to refer to people using generic terms such as the disabled, the cognitively impaired, or you don't want to refer to people with the kind of labeling them as a group. They're a person with a disability. You want to avoid negative terminology like handicapped, crippled, victim, retarded, stricken, poor, unfortunate, or special needs. I think that goes back to the whole idea that it's not the charity model of disability. We all want to be treated just like everybody else. Do not refer to people without a disability as normal, healthy, or average. Okay. I think we're all a little bit different. We all bring unique qualities, skills, and identities to the table. So I don't even know somebody who's normal. We're all different. And okay. Oh, and you put that in the chat. Oh, actually, Jeff has put in Stella Young and her TED Talk. Thank you for sharing the link, Jeff. Really appreciate it. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. So we want to say, when in doubt, you're going to use the person's name. So I might say Liz, and I'm free to share this information because Liz puts it out there that she has a disability. I'd say that Liz Moeller is blind.
Yep, absolutely.
or has a visual, or Liz has a visual impairment?
Yeah, and that's interesting too, Elizabeth, because I personally don't identify as having vision loss. I never had sight, so I didn't have sight to lose. Now, if somebody said I had vision loss, I wouldn't correct them. But if you were to ask me, the term I use is live with a visual disability. But what you said is absolutely correct and is not offensive. So for sure, that's great.
Perfect. So, when in doubt, use the person's name. And so that's again, persons first when you're talking about people first, persons first when you're talking about disability. You want to use the term that the person or the group identifies with, and you can research organizations to see how they talk about different disabilities. For me, I am legally blind. By law, I qualify as being blind, but I prefer the terms I am a person with low vision and or I have a visual impairment. I wouldn't feel comfortable being referred to as blind because I still have a fair amount of usable vision. Whereas Liz, what about you? What do you prefer to terminologies do you prefer?
Yeah, I mean I tend to say, like I said, I tend to say visual disability. I would say blind. It captures it for me. I don't have a lot of usable vision, so I'd really be getting into the weeds if I was to try and explain that to somebody. But sometimes keeping it simple can help too, depending on who you're speaking with. So if you're speaking with someone and really what they need to know is, I can't access your website because I'm blind, just keeping it really simple. I use a device that allows me to listen to what's on my screen. I'm blind. Your website's not accessible. That can be really helpful because really all you're trying to convey there is an inaccessibility. You don't want to get into sort of a whole bunch of terminology that people might not understand. So sometimes keeping it simple can be helpful too.
I agree. And that goes again to use positive terminology when it comes to disability terms. And you want to use clear language. And I think we want to be politically correct. We certainly want to strive and aim for that. But when you use terms sometimes like differently abled, um, that can sometimes be less clear about what the person's disability actually is, and you may want to use kind of a more concise designation. What do you think about that, Liz?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, can we have the next slide, please?
So if you get it wrong, and you will, I get it wrong. Even with disability, I get it wrong. But certainly, you know, apologize. So say you're sorry and apologize for your mistake. And you don't have to make a huge thing about it. And I actually would say when you're correcting somebody, do it politely, respectfully, firmly, but then, let it go. We don't need to sort of expound, I guess is the right word. So sometimes people have called me differently abled, to use a term that we've been talking a lot about today, and I'll just gently correct them after. You don't need to do it publicly. You can do it privately. They'll feel better. You'll feel better. It's less awkward. So apologize and move on. Don't need to make a big thing out of it. Admit responsibility, which is kind of what you're doing when you're apologizing. Make amends and promise to not use that term in the future. And that can be tricky because language is so embedded in our culture, in our society, sometimes even in what we read. Certainly in the newspaper, I've read suffers from as opposed to experiences. So you know what? Just keep trying to be conscious and aware, but you're going to make mistakes. And I think that part of that whole piece too is, and it doesn't say this in here, but I would say also doing a little bit of work to try and kind of understand the language and the terminology that specific person wants to be identified with. So that might mean a little bit of reading or discernment. Sometimes when I'm correcting people, I'll follow up with some resources and just say, hey, I wanted you to have these for your tool belt. I hope that they're helpful. Again, in a corrective, supportive way, not in a way that sort of makes somebody feel badly. But I think that resources can be really powerful tools. So sometimes when I'm suggesting an alternate term, I might say, here's why differently able can be problematic, and I wanted to share some fantastic resources with you, because I think that can go a long way. So we'll pop to the next slide. So only refer to the person's disability when it's related to what you're discussing. So disability is a part of who we are. It isn't all of what we are. So it doesn't need to come up in every single conversation. It doesn't need to be the topic of conversation that you have solely with a person. You know, most of us have lots of interests and lots of hobbies and goals. So it doesn't need to be like the sole center focus of our conversation. So if, for example, we were doing something together and I couldn't see, maybe watching a movie, you might say, oh, I can appreciate that this might be a little bit difficult. How do we want to get around this? And then I'd say, oh, let's turn on the audio description. That'll help. So it's relevant. So you're bringing it up because there's relevance, but you're not bringing it up in every conversation. And you're certainly not bringing it up in a workplace if you've been asked to keep it confidential. And if you are needing to ask about an accommodation and you've been asked to keep that information confidential, then having that conversation privately is really important. I think that's really key, because we most of us, I would probably wager a good number of us, have lots to share beyond our disability.
And I think that's even true. You see it in, and we emphasize this, when you go to a job interview or you're asking for accommodations in the workplace, focus on your abilities as a person. Don't be disability focused.
Yeah, so important.
Overwhelming.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Elizabeth. I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's really important because it can make people uncomfortable, especially if you're sharing personal aspects of your disability. So what we want to focus on is, if you are bringing up your disability, saying, well, as an assistive technology user, I have to be really creative at problem solving, and I'm really good at bringing in a UDL mindset because I have to think about how this is going to be equitable and flexible and, you know, available to a large range of users. And so I have to bring that thinking into my work, and I think that's going to asset your company. So if you are bringing it up, do it in a way where your disability is seen as an asset or a positive, because they are actually. I truly believe that, you know, we do have to be creative and problem solvers and flexible and all the rest of it. But that's when you would bring it up, not in a, like Elizabeth says, not kind of in a way that's making people feel uncomfortable or that's all you're talking about. So we'll go to the next slide. This is a tricky one. Don't assume someone needs your help. And this is, I think, particularly tricky if you're observing somebody navigate who maybe navigates the world a little bit differently than you do. So I'll use myself as an example. Sometimes I might take out my phone and connect to a visual interpreter. So I might stop on the sidewalk and I might be kind of holding my phone up, or I might actually be going the wrong way, but it's because I'm looking for a landmark. And then I find that and I go back the right way. So it can seem to the sighted eye like I'm just not sure where I'm going or what I'm doing, or I have a particular path that I'm following. But it's really important to ask and not assume that we need help, because sometimes we do. We all need help. But there also are times where perhaps we've actually mapped out our route and we know where we're going, or we're using the technology, we're just using it differently. So maybe it does look like we've scrolled past what we're looking for, but actually we're listening, so we haven't actually heard what it is that you're pointing out to us. So that don't assume, ask is really important. And let the person tell you if they need an accommodation, because again, you know, hearkening back to inclusivity and UDL, if you have things that are set in place for a really inclusive meeting, I might not need an accommodation. If you send everything in advance and we're all meeting on Zoom, I don't personally wouldn't need an accommodation. So don't assume that I would or that I won't. Just let me kind of guide that. You can ask, do you need an accommodation? But let that other person kind of guide that conversation. And ask before you help is really important. Sometimes I know that we're creatures of habit, and we like to help. We like to feel good, and we want other people to know that we want to help. That's just human nature, right? But actually asking before you help is really important, because it can be a safety issue. Like maybe you grab my arm and take me across the street, and I didn't mean to go across that street, so now I'm disoriented. Or a less kind of drastic example, you know, maybe you we're at the computer doing something together and you click on something to try and be helpful, but now I'm lost as to where I am on my screen. So just kind of asking before you help is really important. Hey, can I click? I'm noticing that you're scrolling over it. Whatever the situation is, just asking is really important. And don't assume that a person sees their disability as a negative. They might have been born with it, so they might know nothing else, which is the case for me, which is why I don't say I have sight loss. They may, and quite a number of folks do, see their disability as an affirmative positive thing. And not all disabilities are visible. So the worst thing that you can say is, you don't look disabled. Well, what does it even look like, right? So we know that there's typical kind of wheelchair symbols, but disability is way bigger than that. So we really want to refrain from saying you don't look disabled. Not all disabilities are visible. So again, if we're inclusive from the start, harkening back to UDL, then we maybe are thinking about how we can include a broader number of people in our workplaces. Elizabeth, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you. Can you just define, Liz, what does UDL
Oh, sure. Yes, I should have done that because I've used it a few times. Universal Design for Learning. So it's really incorporating a range of learning styles and preferences and modes, or in this case, into your workplace. It's meant for the classroom, but you could certainly incorporate UDL into the workplace to include as broad a number of people as possible in your teaching. So you could just you could take out teaching and think about meetings. So, things like equitable, flexible, is it perceptible and easy to understand? So those are kind of some of the underpinnings of UDL. So really just thinking about different learning styles and how we can accommodate for that. It is not one size fits all, as some people think, but it's really about, if I was to sum it up in a nutshell, thinking about if we build in accessibility from the start, then we're going to have less need at the other end for accommodation. We're not going to erase the need for accommodation, but we're going to have less of a need for accommodation at the other end of that spectrum. I hope that cleared it up.
It did, and I've learned what UDL means because I didn't
Okay,
know,
I'm sorry.
so
I'm glad you caught me on that one. I get it sometimes into the alphabet soup here.
Excellent. Okay, can we go on to the next slide, please? All right. So what you want to do is you want to be able to speak to people directly. When speaking to someone who has a support aide or a companion, you need to address that person directly. And this is especially true when we get people from the deaf or hard of hearing communities where they have maybe a sign language interpreter. You'd be more apt to want to address the interpreter as they're translating, but you actually want to look at and speak directly to the person who is deaf or hard of hearing. That is proper etiquette. So you want to remember that before speaking to someone who is deaf or who has hearing loss, you want to draw their attention. And you want to do it in such a way that you don't startle them. So coming up behind them and tapping them on the shoulder, probably not a good idea. You want to go around and stand in front of them and get their attention by looking directly at them, so you don't scare them. Do you have anything else to add to this, Liz?
I would just say that sometimes people have a communication difference, so they may not speak using words or verbally. They may use a bliss board or an iPad or sign language or body language like pointing. So again, to the extent that you're able, try to engage with that person, even if they're not communicating. I bring this up because even if they're not communicating in the way that perhaps you and I are today, verbally we're speaking and you're listening, try where possible. And then if you need clarification, you might ask the support person and I would say with their permission, like, hey, Elizabeth, I'm having a bit of trouble understanding what you mean. Is it okay if I ask Jeff, your support person here, to help us kind of clarify? That's how I do it. So bringing in consent as well.
Perfect. Can we have the next slide, please? So before we go on to mobility devices, does anybody have any questions about what we've been talking about so far at all? Because I know it's a lot of information to take in. Are there any questions in the chat, or does anybody want to speak up on the video feed at all? Okay. So moving on to mobility devices, a person's mobility aid is a part of their personal space. So be respectful and don't touch. That's true, especially for wheelchairs or scooters. You don't want to move, lean on or move or touch mobility aids such as wheelchairs. You want to plan ahead and clear obstacles or choose accessible locations for meeting and events. And some people also have limited reach, so you might want to ask assistance if they need help with accessing objects. And I know I can speak. I hope you don't mind, Liz, if I can speak from personal experience when I
No,
have
not at
the
all.
pleasure
Not
of
at
your
all.
company. Liz uses a white cane to get around, and I know sometimes when I'm sitting down to a meal with her, or she's folding up her cane to use it, I'll just make sure that it's in a place where I'm not going to trip over it or other people won't trip over it, just to make sure that it gets put in an area where it's safe for her. And I will never take Liz's cane out of her hands. That is her mobility device to help her to get around. And I always try to be mindful of where I'm positioning my body when I'm walking with Liz down the street, so that I'm not bumping into her white cane. And I would think that goes for anybody in a wheelchair or in a scooter. You want to make sure that you're not blocking their path.
Yeah,
Do
it's a
you have
great
any?
point.
Yeah, you don't think about these things until you actually, you go out in social situations, but it's just good etiquette, I think.
Yeah, those are really good points. Absolutely. I have nothing to add there.
All right. Um, can we go on to the next slide, please? So assistive devices and aids. You want to identify yourself when speaking or making physical contact with a person who is blind. I cannot tell you, for me, having somebody come up and say, "Hi, Elizabeth, it's so and so," and they give their name, then I actually know who I'm speaking to, because trying to pick out people in a crowd using facial recognition, oh my goodness, what a challenge that is for me. So when I meet Liz in a crowded area, I will say, "Hi, Liz, it's Elizabeth. How are you?" And then she knows it's me. So it's good etiquette to have. You want to let people know if you are leaving the room. That's so true. And if a person needs to be guided, you need to offer your arm, um, and provide descriptive language. So I will certainly say to Liz, "Liz, can I offer you my arm, my shoulder, or my bag? If you want to hang on to that, it's on the left-hand side." And then usually I'm kind of going ahead and I'm guiding and I'm taking the lead with walking. That's just good etiquette. And it's hard for some people. You don't want to interact with or distract service animals. As much as we'd like to pet the seeing eye dog or give it food, that's a big no-no, not allowed. And you want to plan ahead, clear obstacles, or choose accessible locations for meetings and events. I know when I'm with Liz and we're going up and down stairs, I'll let her know that we're coming to an escalator or a set of stairs and how many stairs there are, just so she can be prepared. Do you have anything else to add to this, Liz?
I think the exits and entrances, so the hellos and goodbyes are really important. Nobody wants to be left talking to air. It's embarrassing, but also it just kind of provides an opening and closure to conversation. So, and also kind of use your judgment. Like if you work with someone every day, you probably don't need to say, "Hi, it's Jessica," every time you start speaking, but you will when you come in and out of a room. So if you're all sitting around a meeting table, maybe for the first couple of times, you'd say your name and then start your thought. And I like in meetings also to say "end of thought" so that I'm not interrupting people and people aren't interrupting me. Um, but perhaps as you get to know your team better, the names aren't needed at the beginning. But I do like the end of thought. It's another, to Elizabeth's point about closings, it means that as a person with sight loss, I'm not cutting you off, and frankly, I think it helps everybody in this virtual space.
And Mufa mentioned that as well. That's the worst ever when a blind person asks, "Hi, recognize me?" Oh my gosh, I'm
Mufa,
out of
you
luck.
that's so good. It's so
I'm out of
true.
luck. Know who I am and expect the person must identify the voice. Although I do go by voice recognition more than I do facial recognition, but still it's a lot to keep straight. So please say your name, okay? It really helps us out with those who are blind or have low vision. Can you go to the next slide, please? So what are the key takeaways from this presentation? You want to use language that conveys our viewpoints. You want to use respectful and intentional language. Language does change over time. Historically, it certainly has. You want to ask people how they self-identify and use the most current terminology. And it's so true. When in doubt, just ask the person, because if you make a mistake, we learn through making mistakes. And don't make assumptions. Always ask, okay? You may think you seem foolish by asking, but you're not, okay? Anything else to add to this, Liz?
I think also just don't make assumptions about abilities, capabilities. Even if you can't imagine how something would be done, if you were in that experiencing that disability, don't assume somebody else can't do it. The thing is that a lot of us have had years of rehabilitation and training, so we've developed skills to navigate our world, and so I think just not making assumptions is also really important.
Absolutely, absolutely. Can I have the next slide, please? So if you have any further questions about the Discoverability Network and signing up, you can contact me, Elizabeth Novak, at elizabethnovak@occ.ca, or you can contact my colleague Boyan Mitrovic, and we can get you signed up and create a profile on the Discoverability Network. We can do some one-on-one training with that. Or maybe you have some questions for Liz about kind of disability etiquette, disability terminology, because Liz is pursuing her PhD studies in disability studies at Western University, and she's so much more knowledgeable, I think, than even I am. So my hats go off to Liz. Liz, maybe you can put your email in the chat if people want to reach out to you. And
Certainly, yep.
I think we can stop sharing the slide deck for now. Thank you.